The doll under the tree. I was 9 years old the year I got the doll. That's what my family calls it now, in hushed tones, like it's some cursed object they don't dare name out loud. And maybe it is. I don't know. All I know is that I didn't ask for it, didn't want it, and it changed everything. It was Christmas Eve in our small Massachusetts town. Snow was falling thick and fast, turning the world outside into a silent wonderland. Inside, the house was warm and glowing with the soft light of the tree in the corner of the living room. Mom had just finished laying out the last of the presents, and Dad was on the couch, nursing a glass of spiked eggnog. My sister, Ellie, was asleep upstairs, and I should have been too, but I couldn't sleep. Something had been bothering me all night. Under the tree, tucked behind the brightly wrapped boxes and shiny bows, was a single gift I didn't recognize. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, and tied with a thin red ribbon. There was no tag, no name, nothing to say who it was for or who had left it. It hadn't been there earlier, I was sure of that. I crept down the stairs in my pajamas, careful not to wake anyone. The house was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the radiator. When I reached the tree, I knelt down and pulled the gift out from the shadows. It was heavier than I expected, and cold, like it had been sitting outside in the snow. Curiosity got the better of me. I tore the paper away, revealing a small wooden box. It was old, the wood dark and worn, and the hinges creaked as I lifted the lid. Inside was a doll. It was unlike any doll I'd ever seen. It wasn't made of plastic or porcelain like Ellie's dolls. This one was carved from wood, its surface painted in faded, peeling colors. Its face was strange, almost human, but not quite. Its lips were curved in a faint smile, and its eyes were the worst part. They were made of glass, so lifelike that for a moment, I thought they blinked. I sat there, staring at it, feeling the kind of unease that only a child can feel. It was the kind of fear you don't know how to name yet, but you know it's real. The doll stared back, its glossy eyes catching the light from the tree. I should have left it there. I should have put it back in the box, tucked it under the tree, and forgotten about it. But I didn't. I don't know why, but I carried it upstairs with me, cradling it in my arms like it was fragile. That night, couldn't sleep. The doll sat on my desk, propped against the wall, its unblinking eyes fixed on my bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt its gaze on me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to a sound, a faint, creaking noise, like floorboards bending underfoot. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. My room was dark, except for the sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The doll was still on the desk, exactly where I'd left it, but it wasn't sitting anymore. It was standing. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The doll's head tilted slightly, its glass eyes reflecting the moonlight. And then, it moved. Not much, just a tiny shift, like it was adjusting its balance. But it was enough. I scrambled out of bed, backing toward the door, my legs trembling. "Mom! Dad!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The door burst open, and my dad rushed in, his face wild with alarm. He turned on the light, and in the harsh glow of the overhead bulb, the doll was back on the desk, sitting as still as ever. "What's going on?" Dad asked, his voice sharp with confusion. I pointed at the doll, my words tumbling out in a frantic mess. "It moved. I saw it. It was standing. It was..." But he didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. He just sighed, muttered something about bad dreams, and went back to bed. The next morning, Christmas morning, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it was a bad dream, just like Dad said. But when we went downstairs to open presents, the doll wasn't on my desk anymore. It was under the tree, and it was different. Its head was turned slightly to the side, and its painted lips were curled into a wider smile, almost like it was mocking me. I didn't touch it again. I told my mom it wasn't mine, that someone must have put it there by mistake. but she just shrugged and said it must have been from a neighbor or a family friend. That night, I locked it in the wooden box and shoved it into the back of my closet. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The noises started that night. Footsteps, faint and shuffling, moving up and down the hallway outside my room, whispering, low and unintelligible, like a radio stuck between stations. And once, just before dawn, I swore I heard laughter. The next morning, the box was open. The doll was on my bed. I tried to get rid of it. I threw it in the trash, buried it under a mountain of wrapping paper and torn ribbons. But by the time I came back upstairs, it was sitting on my desk again. I told my parents everything. The doll moving, the noises, the way it seemed to be watching me. But they didn't believe me. They said it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind. I knew better. The final straw came a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night to the feeling of something cold and heavy pressing against my chest. When I opened my eyes, the doll was sitting on my chest, its glass eyes inches from my face. It smiled. I screamed, flinging it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and fell to the floor. My parents came running again, but this time, they saw it too. The doll, lying on the floor, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, the smile wider than ever. We left the house that night, packed our bags and drove to my grandparents' place 2 towns over. When we came back a week later, the doll was gone. I don't know what happened to it, and I don't want to know. All I know is that sometimes, late at night, I still hear the laughter, and sometimes, when I look outside, I see a small shadow under the tree, waiting. The midnight service. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Growing up, I heard all the usual stories, the kind that make your skin crawl late at night, but I always told myself they were just that. Stories. The kind of tales people make up to explain the unexplainable. But that changed one Christmas Eve. That was the night I learned the difference between stories and reality. It happened 2 years ago, back when I was living in a little New England town called Ashford. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been ripped straight from a postcard, snow-covered streets, old brick buildings, and a towering church right in the center of town. St. Luke's. I wasn't a churchgoer, but that year, something drew me there. Maybe it was the loneliness. I had just moved to Ashford for work and hadn't made many friends yet. Christmas felt empty. So, when I saw the flyer for midnight mass pinned to the bulletin board at the grocery store, I thought, why not? The night was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that bites through your coat and sinks into your bones. The streets were deserted as I made my way to the church, my boots crunching in the snow. St. Luke's loomed ahead, its tall steeple piercing the sky. The building was ancient, its stone walls blackened with age, and its stained glass windows glowed faintly in the moonlight. When I stepped inside, the warmth hit me like a wall. The air smelled of melting wax and old wood, and the soft hum of the organ filled the space. The pews were packed, every seat taken by people dressed in their Christmas best. It was strange, though I didn't recognize anyone. Ashford was a small town, and I thought I'd at least see a familiar face. But these people were different. They were too still, too quiet. The usher, an older man with a solemn expression, led me to an empty spot near the back. I slid into the pew, feeling the wood creak beneath me. That's when I noticed the cold. It was colder inside than it had been out in the snow. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me, but no one else seemed to notice. The congregation sat perfectly still, their heads bowed in silent prayer. I tried to shake the unease creeping up my spine. This was just a church service. I told myself, nothing unusual. The service began with the chiming of the church bell. The sound was deep, resonant, and impossibly loud. It echoed through the sanctuary, shaking the stained glass windows. Everyone rose to their feet in unison, their movements eerily synchronized. The priest appeared at the altar, dressed in flowing white robes. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, and his face was obscured by the shadow of his hood. His voice was low and gravelly as he began the opening prayer. The words unfamiliar and strange. It wasn't Latin, I knew that much, but whatever language it was, it didn't sound human. I tried to focus on the service. But something about the priest's voice made my skin crawl. It was like 1,000 whispers layered on top of each other. A chorus of voices speaking in perfect unison. The congregation responded in the same strange language, their voices blending into a low, haunting chant. I looked around, my heart pounding. This didn't feel right. That's when I noticed their hands. The people in the pews around me were holding hymnals, but their fingers were wrong. They were too long, the skin thin and papery, stretched tight over knobby joints, and their nails black, cracked, and jagged dug into the hymnals like claws. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just the dim lighting playing tricks on me. But then one of them turned to look at me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow sockets, empty and black. I bolted. I stumbled out of the pew, my boots slipping on the cold stone floor. Heads turned as I ran, their hollow eyes locking onto me. The chanting stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. "Where are you going, child?" The priest's voice boomed, reverberating through the sanctuary. I didn't answer. I didn't look back. The doors were just ahead, and I threw myself against them, my hands scrabbling at the iron handles. But they wouldn't budge. "You can't leave," the priest said, his voice suddenly closer. I turned, and he was there, standing just a few feet away. His hood had fallen back, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all. His features were smooth, featureless, like a mannequin carved from wax. The congregation rose as one, their movements jerky and unnatural. They began to advance, their feet scraping against the stone floor. Panic surged through me, and I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "This is a place of worship," the priest said, spreading his arms wide. "You should stay. Join us. Become one of us." I did the only thing I could think of. I ran toward the altar. Behind it, a small door led to the sacristy. I threw it open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The room was dark and cluttered with old furniture, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. I could hear them outside, their nails scratching against the wood. The priest's voice rang out, low and guttural, calling my name. There was another door at the back of the sacristy, and I ran for it, hoping it would lead outside. It did, but not to where I expected. The door opened into the graveyard behind the church. The snow was falling harder now, and the headstones jutted out of the ground like jagged teeth. I ran blindly, my boots crunching over the frozen earth. But I wasn't alone. Shapes moved among the graves, pale and silent. They turned to watch me as I passed, their hollow eyes gleaming in the darkness. I don't remember how I made it home. When I finally burst through my front door, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. My parents were waiting for me, their faces pale with worry. "Where have you been?" my mom demanded. "We've been calling you all night." I tried to tell them about the church, about the congregation that wasn't human, but the words wouldn't come out. Later, when I had calmed down, I searched for St. Luke's online, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The church had burned down 50 years ago. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the church bell. It doesn't matter where I am, whether I'm at home, at work, or out with friends. The sound is always the same, and when I hear it, I know they're calling me back. The shadow in the snow. Let me tell you a story, one that I wish I could erase from my memory. It happened on Christmas Eve, back when I was 16, in a little town called Coldwater, a town buried under snow for half the year and cloaked in silence the other half. That year, the snow was thicker than ever, and the cold cut like a knife. My family, Mom, Dad, my little sister Lucy, and me had a tradition. Every Christmas Eve, we'd build a snowman in our front yard. But not just any snowman. Dad always made sure it was massive, towering over the other houses on our street like a frosty sentinel. He said it was to ward off bad luck, though I always thought he just liked showing off. That year, We outdid ourselves, took hours of shoveling, rolling, and stacking to create the monster of a snowman. Dad carved its face with precision, giving it a lopsided grin and hollow, staring eyes. Lucy thought it was funny. I thought it was creepy. Mom wrapped an old red scarf around its neck, and we topped it with Dad's battered fedora. When we finished, it stood at least 12 feet tall, casting a long shadow across the yard under the moonlight. We took a picture together, standing in front of our masterpiece. Dad laughed, saying, "There he is, old Frosty himself." But when I looked at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that those hollow eyes were looking back at me. The first sign that something was wrong came at midnight. I stayed up late, scrolling on my phone in bed. The house was quiet except for the creak of the old radiator and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A low, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the frozen ground. I got up and peered out my window. The yard was bathed in pale moonlight, and the snowman was gone. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I rubbed them and looked again. There was nothing but a gaping hole where the snowman had been. In its place, a trail of enormous footprints led away from our yard, heading toward the woods at the edge of town. I wanted to wake Dad, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of looking stupid, or maybe it was the quiet dread that had settled in my chest. Instead, I grabbed my coat, shoved my feet into my boots, and slipped outside. The footprints were massive, each one twice the size of my own, and pressed deep into the snow. They shouldn't have been possible. Not unless someone in Coldwater had grown to giant proportions overnight. But there they were, leading away from our house like a breadcrumb trail. I followed them, my breath clouding in the frigid air. The further I went, the quieter it got. No wind, no distant hum of car engines, just the crunch of my boots and the pounding of my heart. The tracks led me to the edge of the woods. I hesitated. Everyone in town knew to stay out of these woods at night. There were stories, whispers about things that moved in the dark, things that weren't natural. But the footprints continued, and something about them compelled me forward. As soon as I stepped into the trees, the air changed. It was colder here, and the shadows seemed alive, shifting and writhing just beyond the edges of my flashlight beam. The footprints wound deeper into the woods, and I followed, each step heavier than the last. That's when I found it. In a small clearing, half buried in snow, was an old well. Its stones were blackened with age, and a rotting wooden cover lay askew on top. The footprints ended here, circling the well as if the snowman, no, whatever had taken its place, had been pacing. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight down into the well. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but I could make out the faint glint of water far below. And then, something moved. At first, I thought it was my reflection, but the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't me. The face staring back was twisted, with hollow eyes and a grin far too wide for any human. It looked like the snowman's face, but alive. And then it laughed. The sound wasn't loud, but it vibrated through me, shaking me to my core. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and plunging into the snow. The laughter grew louder, echoing from the well, from the trees, from everywhere. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back home, but when I burst through the front door, panting and covered in snow, my parents were waiting. Dad asked me where I'd been, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was point to the window. The snowman was back. It stood exactly where we'd built it, as if it had never moved. The scarf was still there, the fedora tilted jauntily on its head. But its grin was wider now, and its hollow eyes seemed to gleam in the moonlight. The next morning, Dad found the footprints. He laughed nervously, saying it must have been a prank. Maybe some teenagers messing with us. But I knew better. I could still hear the laughter in my head, still see that face staring up at me from the well. We tried to go about our day, pretending everything was normal. But by evening, the snowman was gone again. This time, There were no footprints, just an empty yard and a deep sense of unease. That night, we heard it, scraping, thudding, something heavy moving through the house. We locked the doors, turned off the lights, and huddled together in the living room. But it didn't stop. The sound moved closer, up the stairs, down the hall. When it reached my sister's room, the screaming started. By the time we found her, it was too late. Her bed was empty, the window shattered, and the snow outside was stained red. The snowman was back in the yard, grinning wider than ever. We left Coldwater the next day, packed whatever we could carry and drove until the town was nothing but a distant memory. But even now, years later, I can't escape it. Every Christmas, no matter where I am, I hear the laughter, and sometimes, when I look outside, I see footprints in the snow. It's waiting, and it's never going to let me go.